I don't see any visitors today, so glad to see all the members here today, and good to see everyone. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity to study together this afternoon. My box has got all twisted up here, so let me get that fixed. Let's see. Who wasn't here last Wednesday? Who didn't get one of the outlines that we had for? Okay. I need to get a couple of different copies. I'm going to make a couple if y'all would. Or you mind? Yeah, you mind? I've got a sheet right here. Just make a few if you don't mind. Right quick. I should have done it before services, but it's just that's okay. But we're in Ecclesiastes, and we're going to be going. We can't go verse by verse just because we don't have enough time, and so we're going to have to try and move a little bit quicker than that. But I do encourage you to follow along with where we will be tonight. Trying to fix this thing here, and we're going to be starting off right around the beginning of chapter 2. As I said, we can't get through every single verse, but we can cover a pretty good bit. And the outline that we have has 5 different conclusions that are reached in the book of Ecclesiastes. We'll make it through hopefully numbers 1 and 2 today. We're very close to the first one, that being just coming up in just a few minutes in verses 24 through 26 of chapter 2. And then we have one more after that. And so let's go ahead and get over to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. As we said last week, we have the ability to be able to study a book that was written by a very rich man, a very wealthy man, a very wise man, as he has asked God for wisdom, and this being the son of David, this being King Solomon. And so that is who is speaking as we look through this book, obviously inspired by God. But we're going to be, as we said, looking at some of his conclusions about the things that he tried to make himself happy, to have the opportunity to find joy in this life, some of the things that he tried to find that joy in, and how he failed to find that joy in anything but following the Word of God. And so I'm not sure if this is exactly where we stop, but as I said, I'm going to have to start trying to skip around probably a little bit more. And so what I want us to do this evening is start in verse 4 of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And as we begin, we'll probably try and go through about, let's do verses 4 through 17 to do a little bit of reading here at the beginning. But let's start off with that section there. He says, starting there in verse 4, I made me great works. I builded me houses, I planted me vineyards, I made me gardens and orchards, and I planted trees in them all, of all kinds of fruit. I made me pools of water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, and had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, and the peculiar treasure of the kings and of the provinces. I gathered singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments of all sorts. So I was great, and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor which I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king, even that which hath been already done? Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly as far as light excelleth darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool's walketh in darkness. And I myself perceived also that even one event happeneth to them all. He says, Then said I in my heart, as it happened to the fool, so it happened even to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, that this also is vanity. For there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool, for ever seeing that which now is in the day to come shall all be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man as the fool? Therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me. For all is vanity and vexation of spirit. Now, as you see on your outline, with verses 4 through 17 of chapter 2, the main point here, going through this section, is the vanity of great accomplishments. Now, Solomon was a man who was able to accomplish much as king. Perhaps you've heard of the temple that he had built. And if you haven't ever read anything about that, I encourage you to do so, because it just speaks a little bit more to, in chapter 2 here, the riches and the opportunity that he had being the king, and all of the things that he could do with what he had. This temple was just absolutely beautiful and amazing. You can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 7 and 2 Chronicles chapter 4. And so if you have any time yourself to go back and look at that, I encourage you to do so, because like I said, talking about the vanity of great accomplishments, and we think about Solomon, he was a man who accomplished things that were probably inconceivable to some of us, as far as the riches and the ability for him to be able to have the access to the things that he had. He even talked about in the verses that we just read, how anything that he wanted, he could have. And so, looking at verses, of the first few verses there, we see that he begins by talking about all of these physical things, once again, that he has tried to find happiness and joy in. He talks about building houses, orchards, gardens, all of those things that would signify wealth and prosperity at that time. Pools of water to bring forth his trees. He had servants, he had maidens, he had literally anything that he wanted, he could have. And he had everybody to sort of, be able to be there to serve on him as well, anything that he wanted. He talks about how he had musical instruments that were played in his kingdom. And as we were going through this in school, one of our teachers said that there was probably not a musical instrument that was even known at that time that was not played in Solomon's court. So he had access to just huge numbers of basically anything that he wanted. There was not going to be anyone that told him no to one of his commands. And so all of those things, the access that he had to all of those different things, and still he was not able to find happiness. He was not able to find joy in those things other than just for mere moments. And once again, he calls those things vanity. They're not worth working for, because they indeed, once again, are physical things that are going to disappear. I mean, he even says in verse 9, he even says himself, and this is not him bragging or boasting, this is just a fact of the position that he found himself in. He says, so I was great. He's just going to come right out and say it. I had everything that anyone could have ever wanted, and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Not only was I great, but you think about the people who came before me, I was greater than even any of those. So I was the greatest that this city, this people had ever been able to see. And he says there, also my wisdom remained with me. Now we talked about this a little bit in the past, not too long ago, about how we can have knowledge and wisdom, but if we don't use it in the correct way, that it's not really going to do us much good. And it depends on how we choose to use that knowledge and wisdom, if it is going to help us in what we're trying to do in our lives or not. And so Solomon was a man who at this point in time had wisdom, but he had no prudence, I guess would be a good word to use there. Prudence being acting with or showing care for his future. It was all about the physical. It was all about those things which he could accumulate, looking for joy with those things. And so he wasn't using that wisdom in a very good way. Verse 10 talks about how anything his eyes desired, anything that he wanted, anything that he saw, he could have in a heartbeat. He could just say, you know what, I like that, I want it. And he would be able to obtain that. He says there that he withheld not his heart from any joy. So there was literally nothing that Solomon could not have had if he desired it. Now, it's sort of hard for us to understand that in a way, I guess, with the position that we find ourselves in today. It's difficult to imagine literally being able to see something and anything that you desire, being able to have it only in a few seconds or a few minutes. Only even some of the most wealthy people in today's society still sometimes have difficulty getting some of the things they want. And really, when we think about that, we think about those rich people in our society today and those who have power because of their money and their prestige, then they look for happiness as well in all the wrong places. In verse 11, he says that he looked at the works that his hands had wrought and on the labor that he had labored to do, and it was still all vanity and vexation of spirit. Let's go over to the book of Galatians for a moment. Galatians chapter 5, and let's look at verses 24 through 26. Galatians chapter 5, 24 through 26. Let me get over there myself. And they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not be desirous of vain glory, provoking one another, envying one another. So really, when we look at this passage here that we're talking about in Galatians, we sort of are seeing the same thing that Solomon is learning here, that he can do as much as he wants as far as physical things are concerned, but all of these things are going to be in vain. Any questions, comments, anything about that so far before we get into the second half of that little section there? Galatians chapter 5, verses 24 through 26. All right, so basically what we're seeing here in chapter 2 is the same thing that we saw in chapter 1. All the way through these first couple of chapters, he's speaking of all the things that he had, all the things that he tried, all the things that he wanted, all the things that he did, still did not find any of them worth working for, because all of them were going to at one day disappear. They're not going to bring anything to him as far as being able to last anything past this life. And we know that there's not going to be anything, but sort of looking through this, we see some of the things that some people, even in today's society, try and find that joy and happiness in. A lot of people, if they would have thought about being in the position of Solomon at this time, would have thought, well, this is just the pinnacle. This is the top of the top. That you can't get any higher than this on this physical earth, because this man literally can do and have anything that he wants. And still, he is not finding that joy that he's seeking. And so, like I said, we see that a lot of times even in today's society with those who have access to be able to do those types of things. Let's skip down to verse 14. Actually, let's just go ahead and read verses 12 through 14, just because it kind of all goes together here. And I turned myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. And what can the man do that cometh after the king, even that which hath been already done? Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. And I perceived also that one event happeneth to them all. What's that one event? Death. That's right. So basically he's saying here, it doesn't matter about all these physical things. It doesn't matter if I have worldly wisdom, if I've had worldly success. Eventually, all of us are going to pass away from this life, and then what's that worth? And so that's sort of the conclusion that we see him coming to here. Basically, this verse 14 talking about how the fool walks in darkness, the foolish man does not use the eyes that are given to him to be able to walk in the way that he should. But as Solomon said here, that event, being death, happens to all, whether it be those who are wise or those who are foolish. Verses 15 and 16 talk about, he says there, then said I in my heart, as it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise than I said in my heart that this is also vanity? So once again, sort of going back to that, what we just saw, him understanding this worldly wisdom is not going to do me any good, because I'm going to die, I'm going to leave this life just as the fool is. And so once again, I can spend all the time in the world that I want to on gaining worldly wisdom, but in the end it's not going to profit me anything. He says in verse 16, there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever. Seeing that which now is in the days to come shall all be forgotten, and how dieth the wise man as the fool. So as we were studying through this in Memphis, one of our teachers told us that death in Solomon's eyes here is that great equalizer, and not just in Solomon's eyes, but it is true that no matter if you're rich or poor, no matter if you're wise or foolish, no matter if you know a lot or you don't, as far as the world is concerned, death is that great equalizer. One day we're all going to pass away from this life. And so, we still sort of learn as we go through, and I hope that we understand this as we go through this book here, that we still learn from Solomon's wisdom. He comes to these conclusions, and we can learn a lot from these conclusions. Sometimes we have some people in the world today who act like because they have riches and because they have wisdom and because they've been successful in all these different ways, that somehow they almost act invincible. They almost act like, well, that's never going to happen to me. But it is, to every single one of us. And it's one of those things that, we don't necessarily like to think about. But at the end of this life, when all of those things are gone and we meet the Lord in judgment, none of those things, to use the old phrase, mean a hill of beans. There's no profit in any of those things, and that's what Solomon is figuring out here as he goes through this. So we see then in this first section the vanity of these accomplishments, these great accomplishments, and how they still are not what he is searching for. Any questions, comments, anything anybody wants to bring up about that first section? Our second section then is going to be verses 18 through 23 of chapter 2, the vanity of hard labor. This one's a little bit shorter, so we won't spend near as much time on this one. He said, Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall bear or be after me. And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? Yet shall he have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. Therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. For there is a man who labor is in wisdom, and in knowledge and in equity Yet to a man that hath not labored therein shall he leave it for his portion. This also is vanity and a great evil. For what hath man of all his labor, and of the vexation of his heart, wherein he hath labored under the sun? For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief, yea, his heart taketh not rest in the night. This is also vanity. Anything that stands out to you in these verses here? Anything that you sort of see that would you'd like to mention about any of these? I'm trying to do my best to let y'all have some opportunity to speak before I go through them. Anything that stands out to you at all with what he's saying in these few verses?
I think that most of us don't mind reading stuff very short. And I think the man he's talking about is his son that's going to follow him here. So I don't grasp quite what he's saying here as far as the budget that he's going to get what he would work for. I think most people in today's time work
Yeah.
something with their children.
Yeah, they do. And I understand, that's something that we want to do is leave our descendants that come after us, our children, in a good place. Solomon, to me, here is just sort of, he's to the point where he's just very upset and confused, I guess, and really doesn't know.
Nothing he says here is spiritual.
Yeah, exactly.
All he sees is what's in front of him right now. He can't see.
He's not seeing the big picture, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
He probably gets to it at the end of the chapter or book.
Yeah.
When he comes back and brings everything back.
Mm-hmm. So I see sort of the same things that y'all are seeing in this, and some of this is a little bit difficult to understand as we go through it, but I did my best to kind of get some notes on these. Our accomplishments, our physical accomplishments are good as far as that is concerned with this life, and it's good that we can do those things, and if we're able to do things to put our children or our grandchildren in a better spot or whatever that might be, those are all good things. But I agree with what was said just a moment ago, that all of his focus is still on earthly and physical things. It's still and there's no spiritual thoughts here as far as the things that he's talking about. And I think in a way too, he's sort of saying here with this section that these accomplishments are good, but it's almost as if he has the attitudes that's sort of like, well, if I hadn't have done it, then I'm not going to be remembered for it because somebody else would just come along and do it right after me if I hadn't done it myself. And so what was it worth to try and spend that time on that certain thing, a physical thing? And so it's sort of an attitude of these accomplishments are going to be forgotten and other accomplishments are going to be praised in the future. And so when that next person, the child or the grandchild or whoever comes along, the things that I've done are going to be sort of forgotten. They're going to be pushed to the background, and other things are going to be celebrated. And so why do we continue to labor as we do for these physical things? And so that's sort of the attitude that I think that he's got here. I'm not saying that he is obviously in a completely able to be to the point where all of this makes sense for us as far as some of the things that he says. Obviously, as we said before, we want to do good for ourselves and also to be able to leave children and grandchildren, all of those things in a better place if we can. But in the attitude that he's got here, still he's focusing on just the physical things. And so that's sort of the conclusion that I came to. And I think when we read the final few verses here, we're gonna kind of reinforce that. So verses 24 and 26 are the first conclusion that we were going to try and reach tonight. in that God gives contentment from these strivings. God gives contentment from these strivings. So looking at verses 24 through 26, he says, "There is nothing better for a man that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, that it was from the hand of God." He says, "For who can eat, or who else can hasten hereunto more than I? For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight wisdom, and knowledge, and joy, but the sinner he giveth travail to gather and to heap up, that he may give to him that is good before God. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit." So he sort of, I think we sort of see him become a little bit more aware of the spiritual here, and he starts understanding that these good things that he is able to enjoy, and these good things that he is able to leave for his children and his grandchildren or whoever is going to come after him, that it's good, but it's only good because these are blessings from God, and that God has blessed him with these things. He is able to enjoy that labor, and it is a blessing from God. So it's not good just because it's something physical, but it's only good because he understands that these things come from God, and that God wants those blessings to be understood, and he wants those blessings to be enjoyed as long as it is in his ways. But understanding that those things are still at some point going to end up going away, and so understanding that God is at the center of this. And so when he begins to sort of realize that those things are from the hand of God, he sort of begins to change his attitude a little bit towards some of these things. So that is our first conclusion there. God gives contentment from the strivings. And that is a common thing that we're going to see throughout this whole book, is that the only thing that gives any contentment to Solomon, the only thing that gives him any sort of joy that is going to last, is when he realizes that God is the one who is giving him this joy. And that is basically the whole point of the entire book. And so we see that there. Any other comments, questions, or anything about that second chapter?
I think God, like any other father, see his kids do well.
Yeah.
It would be earthly right now, but all those things matter. If we don't go out and work and do the things we need to do, we can't come here and provide for the church.
Sure. Sure.
We need to have that drive to want to go out and do better and be better, and our kids as well. But we also need, I think, to teach our kids to do for themselves. I don't want anything my dad had.
Yeah.
You've got a pair of pliers that are purple handles, ragged cages with pictures of Indian ones picked up from an old guy. That's what I told him. That's all I want. I'm not waiting around for him to die so I can do what I need. Some parents who think they have to work till they're ready to fall over to send kids to fancy schools and fancy weddings. I was in the army to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
So do for yourself and learn for yourself. I think that's what a father really wants for their
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. Sure. Anybody else? Yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely. So that's sort of really what we're seeing here, is that those priorities are a little bit messed up, but he begins to realize later on, how those things need to be focused on as far as the spiritual more than those physical things. We'll just kind of cover this. We're not going to go verse by verse necessarily, but we'll kind of read a verse and then look at some notes here. Verses 1 through 22 of chapter 3, the heading that we have, God controls it all, time, condition, and judgment of our lives. And so he begins in verse 1, he says, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven." Meaning that there is appointed occasion for all the things that we experience in our lives. God knows when those times are coming. Verse 2 says, "A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted." Now, I did want to mention one thing about this specific verse, I think this is true when we really think about it. The Lord knows when our time will come to leave this earth. He knows. And I'm not saying that He doesn't. But I don't know that time is necessarily set specifically by God. And the reason that I say that is because we have a certain role that we play in that. And if it was specifically set by God in that way, then in a way it sort of takes away from our free will, and the decisions that we make don't have any effect on our lives at that point, as far as our living and death and our health and things like that are concerned. And so while God does know when that time is coming, it's not a time that is necessarily set by Him. We do have a part to play in that. But there is, we can be sure, a time to be born and a time to die, and that time will come at some point for all of us. He says in verse 3, he says, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. So in this one, sort of think of a war, warring nations. There's a time in war where it's time to fight, and a time to kill, and a time to try and defeat the enemy, and then there's a time after the war, after the battle, to attend to the wounded, to be able to help those who are injured. And he also talks about the time to break down and a time to build up. And so, once again, using that sort of example that we have of the army, when an army takes a city, there is a time for them to tear down the walls to be able to storm the city, and then after that, there's a time for them to build them back up so that the city is once again fortified so they don't get taken away from them. So there's times appointed for all of these things. He said a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. I thought this was interesting. In old times, when they would sow a field, when they would go out and they would work to plant crops, one of the first things that they would have to do would be go out and to remove the stones from that field. And so there is a time for them to go around and to cast away the stones. But there's also a time after the field is planted where they would go back and gather up the stones and build sort of a wall, a fence around that field to keep things out of that field. And so that's time for them to go back and gather the stones. Once again, seeing how all of these things have their specific time. He says a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time of love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboureth? I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. This sort of refers back over to Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 13. We can go back and sort of connect these two. And as I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven, this sore travail hath God given to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. Trying to sort of quickly go through some of this with the time that we've got left here. He says in verse 11 and 12, he says, He hath made everything beautiful in His time. Also He hath set the world in their hearts so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. So, once again, referring back to what Jeff said just a moment ago, and seeing what God wants for His children, it is true, very true, that God does want good for His children. He wants good things for us. He doesn't want us to live lives that are miserable and that are we hate or that we don't enjoy living. And we are allowed to enjoy the fruits of our labor as long as it is under His terms. But it's about those priorities that we were talking about just a moment ago as well. Where are those priorities? Is it on the physical things, or is it all an understanding that these are blessings from God and that they have been given to us as gifts to be able to enjoy in God's way? How are we looking at those things? Questions or comments about that first section before we get through the rest of chapter 3? We may end up having to stop around into chapter 3 here. So we'll go ahead and read verses 14 through 22, I believe it was. Yeah, 14 through 22, and try and get the rest of that section done. I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it, and God doeth it, that men should fear before him. That which hath been is now, and that which is to be hath already been, and God requireth that which is past. And moreover I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. In my heart, or I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. So here we see that while there is a time for everything physically in our lives, all these examples that we had at the beginning of this chapter, and there is a time for all these physical things in our time, there's also a time that we're also going to be judged when this life is over, and that is also appointed to all of us. And so sort of what we see here is that we must be prepared again for that time. Those times are coming. At some point in the future, we all will face God in judgment, we'll face His Son in judgment, and so we understand that that we need to be prepared for that. He says, I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, and that they might see that they themselves are beasts. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them, as the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they all have one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. All go unto one place, all are of dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth down to the earth? Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? This last little section here is sort of unique in that he begins to compare man and beast together, saying, I forgot to turn my sound off on my computer apparently. He says there, talking about the similarities between how we're all going to die, which we know that he mentioned just a moment ago, but then he starts saying that basically every living thing, everything that has breath one day is going to die. Now the big difference, obviously, and he mentions this in verse 21, he talks about the spirit of man that goes upward and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth. And so when an animal dies, when it passes away, when it's gone from this earth, there's no spirit that somehow goes to heaven or hell or anything like that. An animal doesn't have a spirit. Man is different from the animals in that we have a spirit that lives on through eternity. And so we all do die, yes, and that is part of life. But we also understand that that we have a soul, a spirit that is going to live on through eternity, and that is what is most important for us. So I know I've done a lot of reading and we've had to hurry kind of quickly. I didn't really get as much as I wanted to done, and so I'm going to have to figure out a better way to get through some of this next week to try and skip over some verses. But I don't want to leave out anything that's important. And so any questions or comments or anything that anybody has seen?
Is he learning this on his own, or has he got scriptures to go by? Or?
Well, this would be something that, and he sort of talks about this in the parts of the book that he has learned from experiences that he has had in his own life. And he is, as we said before, he is a very wise man in that he prays to God for wisdom. And so, he prays for that wisdom, but a lot of these things that he talks about is experiences and ways that he's tried to find joys and successes in his own life, where he's been able to endure these things and to be able to have these opportunities, and he still cannot find the joy that he's looking for. So a lot of it is because of the fact that he is rich and he is the king and he can provide himself with all these things, and he still continues to realize as he's trying to provide himself with all these things to provide joy for himself, but none of them are bringing exactly what he's looking for because they're all still physical. So,
But at the same time, though, he's not doing nothing to displease God.
well, that's probably debatable. But yeah, there are some things in here that when we see some of the things that he's done, that we would say, he probably should not have done what he did in certain places. But we'll see, too, as we go through the book, how he sort of learns from those mistakes and things like that as well. But there are some places where he has definitely gotten into some things that God would not have had him to be doing, not using his wisdom, as we said before, in a way that is focused on the future as much as it is just the here and now and the physical. And so that's something that he sort of learns as he goes through the book, and that we'll see as we continue to go too. So, any other questions, comments, anything?
He says that they had the spirit of wisdom, and that doesn't mean that God turned him into a robot.
Right, yeah, exactly. He has to choose to use that in a way that's going to be profitable to himself. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
But what I'm getting at is back in those days, if a king or something did something that God was pleased with, he did something to him to strike him down or something, right?
Sometimes it depends on what the situation is, and sometimes God is a loving God, but God is also a just God, and so sometimes we see Him through the Old Testament take people who have chosen to live a life that is against Him, and He will do something like destroy them or take away their kingdom or something of that nature. But sometimes, God in His infinite knowledge also understands that there are some people who can change and some people who can eventually be able to, like Solomon, use the knowledge that they've got for good instead of bad. And so he does give them the opportunity to get to that point in their lives. A lot of the people that we see who he destroys, takes away kingdoms and things of that nature, you could argue that those kingdoms and those people were so far gone from God that God knew that there was no way that they were ever going to be able to return to Him. And so it was really one of those things that even if He had left them alone, it was just going to cause more evil and more sinfulness. And so that's why He does what He does. And so it really just depends on the situation. Any other questions, comments, or anything anybody's got?